Good morning. I am got late. This is the end of chapter 5, page 60. Dr. Meyer told the investigators that it would have taken some time for the brain swelling to develop, and there likely had been a period of JonBenet's survival from the time she received the blow to her head when she was eventually strangled. He reported that this would have likely been a lethal blow, that he did not think it was likely that she regained consciousness. The bulk of the autopsy had been completed by mid-afternoon, but Dr. Meyer wanted another opinion about the injuries that had been inflicted upon the genitalia. Over the course of the investigation, a number of forensic pathologists would study JonBenet's injuries and offer professional insight into what could have happened to this little girl. Dr. Meyer called together the Boulder County Child Fatality Advisory Review team that afternoon. The protocol established the coroner's office that the coroner's office called for the review of the child's fatalities that took place in the county. Members who served on the team were comprised of people from the Boulder Police Department, Boulders County Coroner's Office, the Boulders County Sheriff's Department, the Boulders District Attorney's Office, and the Boulders County Department of Social Services. The team was provided with a briefing on what had taken place at the Ramsey's home following the report of the kidnapping, and Dr. Meyer gave an overview of the autopsy findings. A number of things were discussed during this meeting, and the group determined that there was a number of questions that needed to be researched. They were interested in the family history and wanted to know if there had been any signs of previous sexual abuse with members of the family. There was an interest in determining if there had been any recent behavioral changes with the child at their schools. With the children at their schools. It suggested that the teachers and classmates of JonBenet and Burke be interviewed. They were interested in determining if Patsy had ever been abused as a child and what kind of behavioral changes had taken place after her bout with cancer. They also wanted to know about how the parents were interacting with their son and felt it necessary that an interview be conducted with him by investigators. The first meeting of the Child Fatality Review team completed, Boulder police investigators now had another set of investigative priorities established for them in the early stages of this investigation. Following the meeting, Dr. Meyer returned to the morgue with Dr. Andy Surantok, chief of Denver's Children's Hospital Child Protection Team, so that a second opinion could be rendered on the injuries observed to the vaginal area of JonBenet. He would observe that the same injuries that Dr. Meyer had noted during the autopsy protocol and concurred that a foreign object had been inserted into the opening of JonBenet's vaginal orifice and was responsible for the acute injury witnessed at the 7 o'clock position. Further inspection revealed that the hymen was shriveled and retracted, a sign that JonBenet had been subject to some type of sexual contact prior to the date of her death. Dr. Surantak could not provide any opinion as to how old those injuries were or how many times JonBenet had been assaulted, and would defer to the expert opinions of other medical examiners. Dr. Meyer would prepare a brief press release at the end of the day announcing the cause of JonBenet's death had been asphyxiation by strangulation. Estimating the time of death would take longer to establish and was not mentioned in the announcement regarding her murder. The manner of death was ruled to be a homicide. This is chapter 6, interpreting the injuries. Dr. Meyer was concerned about JonBenet's vaginal injuries, and he, along with Boulder investigators, sought the opinions of a variety of other physicians in the days following her autopsy. Dr. Surantok, a pediatrician with Denver's Children's Hospital, had recognized signs of prior sexual trauma, but neither he nor Dr. Meyer were able to say at any degree of certainty what period of time this may have involved in the abuse. What period of time may have been involved in the abuse. Experts in their field, physicians and forensic pathologists were consulted from St. Louis, Missouri, Dade County, Florida, Wayne County, Michigan, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to name just a few. They examined the series of photographs that depicted the injuries that came to the opinion that JonBenét had been subjugated to sexual intrusion prior to the insertion of the foreign object that had created the injury at the time of her death. It was their opinion that this type of injury present with the hymen suggested that several different contacts have been made in the past and that digital penetration was consistent with this type of injury. The physicians were unable to date the previous injury or specifically quantify the number of times that JonBenét had been assaulted, but were confident in their opinions that she had been subjugated to a sexual contact prior to the day of her murder. This particular information suggested that someone close to JonBenét had been responsible for abusing her in the weeks or months preceding her murder. As is often the case involving this type of childhood abuse, investigators had to consider the possibility that a family member, relative, or someone close to the inner circle of the family was responsible. Swallowed the Christmas spirit. Oh my God. Sorry. This particular information suggested that someone close to JonBenét had been responsible for abusing her in the weeks or months preceding her murder. As is often the case involving this type of childhood abuse, investigators had come to consider the possibility that a family member, relative, or someone close to the inner circle of the family was responsible for the prior acts and the possibility of the murder of JonBenét. Someone had to have had access to JonBenét on repeated occasion to have perpetrated these injuries. Dr. Lucy Rourke, a neuropathologist with the Philadelphia Children's Hospital, helped examine the timing of some of the injuries sustained by JonBenét. She told investigators that the blow to the skull had immediately began to hemorrhage, and it was not likely that she would have regained consciousness after receiving this injury. The blow to the head, if it was left untreated, would have been fatal. The presence of the cerebral edema, swelling of the brain, suggested that JonBenét had survived for some period of time after receiving the blow to her head. Blood from the injury slowly began to fill the cavity of the skull and began to build up pressure on her brain. As pressure increased, swelling was causing the medulla of the brain to push through the foramen magnum, the narrow opening at the base of the skull. Dr. Rourke estimated that it would have taken an hour or so for the cerebral edema to develop, but that this swelling had not yet caused JonBenét's death. Necrosis, the neurological changes to the brain cells, indicated a period of survival after the blow that could have ranged from anywhere between 45 minutes to 2 hours. As pressure in her skull increased, JonBenét was beginning to experience the effects of brain death. Her neurological and biological systems were beginning to shut down, and she would have been exhibiting signs of shy and stroke breathing. These are short, gasping breaths that may be present as the body struggles to satisfy its need for oxygen in the final stages of death. The medical experts were in agreement. The blow to JonBenét's skull had taken place some period of time prior to her death by strangulation. The bruising beneath the garrote and the petechial hemorrhaging in her face and eyes were conclusive evidence that she was still alive when the tightening of the ligature ended her life. The medical consultants considered the timing of the tracking of the pineapple that had been moved through JonBenét's digestive tract. It was generally agreed that the timing of the ingestion of the fruit would have coincided with the time frame regarding her head injury. It was estimated that it would have been between 2 to 5 hours for the pineapple to move through her system. It appeared to investigators that she had eaten pineapple not long before receiving the blow to her head. Dr. Warner Spitz, the forensic medical examiner for Wayne County, Michigan, had conducted extensive studies on the wounds caused by the application of force and was considered a leading expert on the topic. He offered an opinion on the sequencing of injuries that had been inflicted upon JonBenét during her murder. This first injury sustained by JonBenét was believed to have been the construction marks on the sides and front of her throat. He believed that her assailant had grabbed her shirt from the front and twisted the collar in their fist. The cloth from the edge of the collar had created the discolored striated bruising and abrasions on the side of her neck, and the knuckles of the perpetrator had caused a triangular-shaped bruise located on the side of her throat. 2. JonBenét reached up to the neck with her hands in the attempt to pull away from the collar, causing some nail gouges, abrasions with her fingernails on the side of her throat. 3. Released the grasp of the perpetrator. JonBenét turned and was struck in the upper side of her head with a blunt object. Dr. Spitz would subsequently offer the opinion that the barrel of Maglite brand flashlight found in the kitchen on the counter of the Ramsey's home was consistent with the rectangular shape of the skull fracture. JonBenét's head injury continued to bleed internally until her strangulation. 4. The blow would have rendered JonBenét unconscious and accounted for the absence of any additional defensive wounds on her body. Dr. Meyer had noted during the autopsy no further signs of struggle, i.e. broken fingernails, bruising on her hands, or fingernail scrapes on her face near the duct tape. 5. Inflicted perimortem with her death was the insertion of the paintbrush handle into JonBenét's vaginal orifice. The presence of inflammation and blood in the vaginal vault indicated that she was still alive when this assault took place, but it was believed that this took place very near the actual time of death. 6. The lasting injury sustained was a tightening garrote around JonBenét's throat that resulted in her death by strangulation or asphyxiation. Investigators would also enlist the aid of a knot expert, John Van Tassel, on the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. He would eventually determine the slip knots used in the wrist and neck ligatures were from a standard fare. The end of the cord wrapped around the remains of the paintbrush were observed to be concentric loops and ended in a simple hitch that was secured by a knot in place. Again, there was nothing particularly fancy about the knots, suggesting that a skilled perpetrator had been responsible for tying them. Investigators took note of the fact that the end of the cord was wrapped around the broken paintbrush and of the handle had been burned/melted. The manufacturer of these types of nylon cords will burn or melt the ends during production so that the ends will not fray and disassemble. In this instance, it appeared that the cord tied around the handle of the garrote was the first piece used from a new roll of cord, and that the pieces used on the other end were all frayed and had been cut with a sharp instrument. If the pieces of wood and cord had been used in the sequence to their cutting and assembly, it appeared to investigators that the garrote could have been the first of the pieces applied in JonBenét's death. The piece of cord used to bind her wrist, an important element in the control of a kidnapped victim, might not have been applied until after the noose had been wrapped around JonBenét's neck. This fact, coupled with the odd length of cord that separated the loose bindings used on her wrist, suggests that some form of staging might have taken place. It was a matter of speculation to be certain, but only the killer would know for sure the sequence in which the cord had been applied to JonBenét. Moreover, given the fact that JonBenét's hair was entangled in the slip knot at the back of her neck, investigators concluded that the perpetrator had fashioned this ligature spontaneously at the scene. It had not been constructed before their entry into the home. As previously noted, John Ramsey had removed the piece of tape covering his daughter's mouth upon discovering her body. Investigators would closely examine the markings on JonBenét's face to determine the location of its placement. Mucus emitting from her nose suggested to them that the tape had been placed over her mouth after some period of time and not necessarily on the outset of her abduction. Additionally, there were the impressions of a perfect set of imprints on JonBenét's lips on the sticky side of the tape. Investigators thought that if she had been alive and struggling during the time of placement, the imprint would have been irregular and smeared. Mucus beneath the tape and the perfect imprint of lips led investigators to believe that this might have been another element of staging that had taken place sometime after JonBenét's death. Investigators would subsequently obtain records of JonBenét's medical treatment from the offices of her pediatrician, Dr. Francisco Boeuf. They would learn that JonBenet had visited the doctor's office on 33 occasions over the previous 3 years, and that Patsy Ramsey had called his offices 3 times on the evening of December 17th. The reason for these calls was never determined. It should be noted that JonBenét's pediatrician contradicted the opinions of the experts who believed prior sexual contact had been taken place before JonBenét's murders. Having seen and treated JonBenet for various ailments on the 33 occasions over the course of a 3-year period of time, he would state that he never witnessed signs of vaginal abuse being present during her visits. And though it is reported that a number of these visits were for vaginitis, thought to be related to JonBenét's bedwetting problems, it is not clear if it were his practice to conduct within his practice to conduct vaginal exams on 6-year-old girls at the time that he provided this statement. As helpful as all this information was in painting a picture of what happened to JonBenet, it did not specifically identify the person responsible for her murder. This is chapter 7. Press release provided by Ramsey publicist Pat Corton, 1997, January. This is from the news media. John and Patsy Ramsey have cooperated extensively with the police and other law enforcement authorities since the very beginning of the investigation, and this cooperation will continue. Written answers to all written questions submitted by the Boulder police have been delivered to them this afternoon. Why are they so angry? Chapter 7, Media Wars. The Wars of the Media. On Saturday, December 28th, 1996, Assistant District Attorney Pete Hofstorm. Okay. I forgot how the story went for a minute. Assistant District Attorney Pete Hofstorm informed detectives that the family had retained legal counsel and were not willing to meet with the police investigators. He suggested that any questions they had be reduced to writing and that he would forward these to the Ramsey Defense Counsel. A list of 16 early questions. Merry Christmas. A list of 16 early questions was presented to Hofstorm, but it took weeks before the answers to these basic questions were returned to authorities. Clarifying questions posed were like the following. What was JonBenet wearing when she went to bed that night? What did JonBenet have to eat that night? These were basic things that police had not been able to record during the hectic events of that morning. Rick French at one point characterized his efforts at obtaining this information as a series of 20 hectic and scattered discussions taking place, during which time some things were never pinned down. The circumstances surrounding these early events were puzzling to investigators. It was understandable that the family needed the time to make arrangements to bury their child, but why wouldn't the family want to meet with the people responsible for investigating the death of their daughter? The Ramseys had not yet returned to Boulder after the services in Georgia and were already taking steps to engage with the media. At some juncture during the stay in Atlanta, a family friend with connections was able to arrange an interview with CNN. The course of action and the fact that the family attorneys had been hired to represent the Ramsey family reportedly upset Fleet White, who had accompanied the family to Georgia for the services. White could not understand why the family was delaying their return to Colorado to begin their interviews with the authorities. At one point, Fleet White became agitated during a telephone conversation with John Ramsey's brother Jeff, who headed to the family home to continue the discussion. The brother was frightened by the conversation, and Don Pugh, Patsy Ramsey's father, reportedly hid a handgun beneath the cushions of his living room couch in anticipation of trouble. John Ramsey calmed everyone down before Fleet White arrived, and nothing further came of the incident. Rod Westmoreland was said to be responsible for setting up the CNN interview for John and Patsy, but the Ramseys would later state that it was Fleet White who had encouraged them to go on national television. The poor White family. Merry Christmas, Mr. Fleet White. Okay. I'm so tired, guys. This is my second time reading these 3 books. Let's get it. He subsequently booked a commercial flight home rather than fly on the private jet that was transporting the family and other friends. John Ramsey stated during the January 1st, 1997 CNN interview that the family was now ready to return to Boulder and work with authorities, but that didn't come to fruition. Where are you at, John Ramsey? The police are still waiting. Anytime. Just head on into the police offices. Jesus. Ugh. They instead took refuge in the home of Pasta J. Elowowski and appeared to continue to fortify their team of attorneys. John Ramsey went as far as to hire ex-attorneys to present members of the Pugh family and even his ex-wife, Lucinda Johnson. A Denver-based private investigative firm, Ellis Armstrong, joined the team of attorneys being assembled to work the Ramsey side of the inquiry. The Washington, D.C. public relations firm of Rowan and Belwitt was retained, and soon Patsy Corton was handling the media and releasing public statements for the family. Police continued to attempt to set up one-on-one interviews with each of the parents, but no one could agree on a time or place or the duration of said interview. The days stretched into weeks, and the weeks lapsed into months. At one juncture, police had agreed to meet with the family at an off-site location from their headquarters, but subsequently canceled just days before the meeting after the FBI counseled them that the interview should take place on their home turf. Ramsey's attorney had a field day with the media. They claimed cooperation on part of the family, but the police were being obstinate. The father of Polly Klaas, a 12-year-old girl kidnapped and murdered by a pedophile in California in 1993, publicly criticized the Ramsey family in early 1997 for their behavior on the manor. I think the parents made some terrible mistakes thus far by hiring lawyers and a publicist and refusing to talk to the police. From his personal perspective, Mark Klaas believed that the parents of a murdered child ought to be working side by side with the police investigators and not hiding behind the legal pads and high-priced attorneys. In the meantime, Ramsey's PR firm began to get busy and help publicize the formation of a foundation named in the memory of JonBenét. A nonprofit 501c3 corporation was established with John and Patsy Ramsey listed as the board members. The appropriate paperwork was filed with the state of Colorado and the IRS on March 31st, 1997. Subsequent tax documents reported that the JonBenét Ramsey's Children Foundation intended to do the following: 1. Provide opportunities to children to develop their talents. 2. Build a strong spiritual foundation in children. 3. Promote the safety of children. 4. Promote education on effective parenting and nurturing. 5. Affirm and recognize children who demonstrate compassion for services of others. 6. Recognize responsible journalism that affects children and families and promote good in the world for children. The foundation listed its intention to fund organizations or programs that meet the objectives listed above. It did not intend to conduct any fundraising efforts, but it indicated that it would rely upon donations for family members, friends, cooperations, and unsolicited donations to fund its charitable causes. The foundation also publicly offered a reward of $100,000 for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the persons believed responsible for the kidnap and murder of JonBenét. A reward poster depicting a photograph of JonBenét was printed for distribution along with the private telephone tip line, with no association to the police department or Crime Stoppers listed on this document. Press releases prepared by the PR firm appeared with some regularity in the Denver area print media throughout the spring and summer of 1997. A website, www.ramseyfamily.com, was established in the spring of 1997, and the reward information was posted there, along with the chronological history of the press releases that had been prepared in the Ramsey's private search for the perpetrators of the crime. John Ramsey had also hired retired FBI profile John Douglas to assist them in the case. His involvement is covered a little more in depth in a later chapter, but Douglas flew to Denver to meet with their attorneys on January 8, 1997. By this time, rumors of prior sexual abuse had been flowing through the media reports, and people were jumping to the conclusion that John Ramsey had been responsible for the molestation of his daughter. Regrettably, some of JonBenét's reward posters would show up around town with the father's name plastered all over them. Douglas reports that one of the primary reasons he had been retained by attorneys was to evaluate the possible involvement of John Ramsey in the death of his daughter. Though they did not specifically say it, he was under the impression that his attorneys wanted to know if their client was guilty. Douglas met with John Ramsey for a couple of hours on the morning of January 9, 1997, and proceeded to go over the events of the kidnapping. Ramsey became very emotional. Never seen that guy emotional. As he described finding the body of his daughter. Okay, I mean, I've seen him describe that, I guess. To the relief of the attorneys, Douglas advised that he didn't believe their client had been responsible for the murder of JonBenét. Douglas then met jointly with John and Patsy in the presence of their attorney. Both parents spoke on their experiences and their recollections of the day that JonBenét had been kidnapped and murdered, and stated that they wanted to cooperate with authorities in their investigation. Based on their behavior, Douglas formed the opinion that neither of the parents had killed JonBenét. Though he had not specifically been hired by Ramsey attorneys to establish a criminal profile of the perpetrators believed responsible for the crime, Douglas offered an early theory during his meeting with the family. He thought perhaps a personal cause offender may have been involved, primarily because of the revenge aspects noted in the ransom note. Attorneys had to have breathed a sigh of relief. A nationally recognized expert in the field of criminal profiling had voiced the opinion that neither of the parents was believed to be responsible for the murder of their daughter. In spite of not having had the opportunity to review the full complement of police reports, Douglas would eventually work up a behavioral profile for a possible offender that would subsequently be included in advertisements prepared by the Ramsey's PR firm. Douglas would be interviewed by network media regarding his participation in the investigation, and he eventually devoted an entire chapter of this effort in one of his many books he authored on the subject of criminal profiling. Police prosecutors, the Ramseys attorneys, continued to do battle in the media as they tried to find common ground for a follow-up interview for the parents. Both sides eventually reached a consensus. John and Patsy would be interviewed individually by police investigators on April 30th, 1997, for a time period not to exceed 8 hours. Breaks and lunch would take place over the course of the day of questioning. What a coup. Over 4 months had passed since the discovery of John Benet's body, and now Boulder police had finally been able to convince the parents of this murdered child to sit down with them and to answer some basic questions about the death of their daughter. The Ramseys would continue to broadcast their message to the media following that interview. In July 1997, they issued another press release that seemed to decry the Boulder Police Department's focus on them as suspects in the murder of their daughter. The release, really an advertisement, listed behavioral clues that the public should be alerted to and requested that anyone with information contact their private team of investigators as they were taking a new approach to their search. They announced that the perpetrators might have exhibited the following type of behavior around the time of a kidnapping. 1. A conflict with the female. 2. Conflict with the family. 3. Financial stress. 4. Marital problems. 5. Legal problems. 6. Employment problems. 7. Did that person then suffer a traumatic event such as a breakup of an important relationship, loss of job, or some other disruption in his life that could have triggered violent behavior? Did that person express hostility or anger at either of us or our family? Was he depressed, perhaps using drugs or alcohol? These are very conflicted terrorists. Okay. In August, they issued an advertisement in which they asked the public if they recognized some aspects of the handwriting depicted in the ransom note and included certain letter combinations found in the wording of the note. In another release, the public was asked to recall details about a male who purportedly had been approaching little girls around the 1996 Christmas holidays. This was the first Boulder police investigators had heard about such a tip, and the details on how this led the development are scant. The press release and advertisements would continue unabated for a number of years as the Ramseys financed their own searches for their persons believed responsible for the murder of their daughter. The first 6 months of the investigation were a rocky time. However, as the Ramseys proclaimed that there was a killer on the loose in Boulder. City authorities contradicted this opinion, continuing to maintain that Boulder was a safe community and that its citizens shouldn't be concerned that a child murderer was running amok. These statements suggested that the police were not hunting for a kidnapper-intruder who would have been responsible for the crime. If not an intruder, then who was responsible for the murder of a 6-year-old girl? The politics of the media wars made for good entertainment, but it seemed that at every opportunity, the Ramsey publicists were chastising Boulder police for focusing all of their investigative efforts on the family and not on other potential suspects. The media exchanges would go on for years. All right, we're on page 78. Oh, happy holidays.